A dinner meant for gratitude ended in a chilling secret. Welcome to Marple Manor. I am your host, Hartwell. Tell me, where are you tuning in from tonight? Your voices make these mysteries come alive. Let's begin. In St. Mary Mead, Thanksgiving was not a holiday one celebrated. Not properly. Not with pumpkins and pilgrim hats, and the marshmallow abominations Mrs. Price Ridley had once encountered on a ghastly New York tour. It was therefore a matter of some curiosity, genteel in its way, sharp in others, that Mrs. Honoria Calhoun of Maple House proposed to give a Thanksgiving dinner, just as we have it back home. Mrs. Calhoun was American, wealthy, and only recently installed in the village, where Maple House had stood shuttered through 3 rectors and 2 wars. She was handsome in a glossy fashion, and wore the sort of pearls the vicar's wife, Mrs. Julian Pike, privately envied and publicly disapproved. The invitations were scarce enough to be talked about. The Pikes from the vicarage, Dr. Haydock and his niece, Colonel and Mrs. Armitage, retired and conscientious about being retired, young Mr. Dennis Reed from the bank, Mrs. Price Ridley, and, unexpected to some, Miss Jane Marple of the Elms. Miss Marple, as a rule, did not go in for foreign festivals. She liked things harvest-like in their proper season, and if one thanked Providence, it was in a church pew. Still, Mrs. Calhoun had sent a note as warm as toast, and there was the pleasant thought of seeing people, hearing them talk, and noticing, as Miss Marple always noticed, the little likenesses that ran from one human heart to the next, like stitches in a single piece of knitting. Dusk fell early on the last Thursday of November, valuing the hedges and lanes in an old pewter glow. Maple House, with its American flag discreetly folded beside the umbrella stand, Mrs. Calhoun was sensitive to village feeling, shone with lamplight and smells not often known in St. Mary Mead, sage and cornbread, buttery yams, the crisping skin of a great turkey that had caused the butcher to shake his head and the delivery boy to announce to his mother that the Yanks were at it again. The drawing-room offered sherry and an arrangement of chrysanthemums so symmetrical it quite cowed the vicar's wife. Mrs. Calhoun, buoyant, beamed on her guests as if they were presents to be unwrapped. "So glad you came, Miss Marple." "We are doing it the traditional way," she said, patting Miss Marple's hand in a manner that assumed the elderly liked being patted. "Even got cranberries. Do you say cranberry or cranberry? Smuggled in by my London man. And pumpkin pie. You'll die." Miss Marple, who had no intention of doing so, observed the room pleasantly, taking things in with the soft blink of a bird on a branch. There were place cards upon a silver tray on the escritoire, written in a round American hand. A single one, Mr. Dalton, stood apart from the rest, its corner slightly dog-eared and a faint smear of ink across the D as though hastily blotted. "A tiny thing and no business of hers, Dalton?" asked Dr. Haydock lightly, following her glance. "Are we to be spared a member of Parliament?" "Heaven help us. An old friend of my late husband," Mrs. Calhoun said. "He's in London on business, and I thought, well, my late Hank used to say, make room for orphans and old comrades. Hon, so we'll do exactly that." "Quite Christian," murmured Mrs. Pike, who found American warmth unsettling, but approved of Scripture when it appeared with the pudding. It was about this time that the footman, imported from London along with the cranberries, announced that dinner was served. They drifted in, Colonel Armitage with his measured step, Mrs. Price Ridley like a ship under full sail, young Mr. Reed trying to look older, Dr. Haydock amused at everything, and Miss Marple in a pale grey that had seen several winters and would see several more. The dining room was a map of indulgence. Silver glinted. Candles behaved themselves. The turkey, proud as a monument, waited on a sideboard for what the butcher called a proper seeing to. Mrs. Calhoun, with a hospitable flourish, directed them to their places. "We'll sit American style tonight, if nobody minds. It was at that precise, amiable moment that the bell pealed, the front door bell, long and imperative, like a statement rather than a request. The footman, who had been trained for cosmopolitan emergencies and village obstinacies alike, went out. He came back hesitating. "A gentleman, madam. He says he is expected, Mr. Dalton." "Oh, good," Mrs. Calhoun cried, relief rising out of her as steam from a kettle. "Do send him in." The gentleman who entered was of a sort that St. Mary Mead put aside into drawers marked questionable and quite attractive, depending on age and disposition. He was mid-40, perhaps, with the handsome thinning of a face that had carried its share of good fortune. His coat had not been cut in England, and his shoes, though carefully polished, showed the scuffs of long travel. He held his hat respectfully and carried apology well. "My dear Mrs. Calhoun, forgive me. John Dalton. Trains and I have never been on speaking terms." His accent was American, of the polished East Coast kind that let one know a man had been to universities with large lawns and older buildings. Mrs. Calhoun welcomed him warmly. A chair was drawn up and a place card as if by magic, though Miss Marple had seen it earlier. Dog-eared appeared beside Mrs. Price Ridley. Ho stiffened. "Better late than never," Dr. Haydock said cheerfully. "Sit down, man, before the turkey grows shy," Grace was said by the vicar in his nicely rounded voice. Thanks were rendered in terms both general and particular. "For safe journeys," Miss Marple noted mildly, and conversation began in earnest. That lively first course talk, where seating is assessed and allies chosen. Mr. Dalton spoke well enough when pressed, but he was not eager. He ate little. His eyes travelled not so much over faces as over objects, the gleam of a decanter, the pattern of a damask napkin, the door to the hall behind the maid's shoulder. Not the look of a hungry man, rather of one mapping a room he did not mean to leave by the same door. Miss Marple saw these things as she saw most things, without appearing to look. She poured a very little wine, touched none of the oysters, which she didn't trust, and watched Mrs. Calhoun fuss with her pearl bracelet. The clasp was new, the pearls old. Someone had threaded them clumsily, for the smallest one near the clasp bore a minuscule scratch as if from an impatient pin. A silly, silly thing to notice on a night of feasting. Turkey arrived amid admiration. Mrs. Calhoun insisted Mr. Dalton carve. Hank always let John do the honours, and the gentleman rose with a look that might have been reluctance and might have been nostalgia. He handled the knife with practised ease, and, for a minute or two, the conversation concerned itself with nothing scandalous at all. Slices as thick as soldiers, or thin as gossip, the merits of sweet versus chestnut stuffing. Then there was a small oddity. It flew by and would have been nothing if Miss Marple had not seen the like in kitchens and committee rooms for 70 years. Mr. Dalton, reaching across for the serving fork, brushed the place card beside his plate so that it slid nearer to the candlestick. He adjusted it back, yes, but not in the same alignment. The edge overlapped the linen set of the knife, just so. Miss Marple recognized the movement, the kind that showed a man accustomed to marking where things had been before he moved them. The wine circulated. Cranberry sauce stained the white plates in merry theatrical smears. Mrs. Price Ridley was expounding, with the authority peculiar to people who have visited a place once on American elections, when she broke off to cough lightly and dab her lips. "If that is pumpkin," she announced. "I am Cleopatra." "It is," Mrs. Calhoun said, and Cleopatra never had it so good. They were at that easy stage when restraint begins to loosen, when village gossip bubbles to the surface like fruit in a simmering pot, when Colonel Armitage, who did not drink, warmed merely from the room's pleasure. It was then so gently that at first it seemed no fuss at all, that the maid, a neat little mouse of a girl named Elsie, slipped through the door to the hall and did not return. No one noticed for a minute, because no one notices a quiet servant going out of a room. Then the footman clearing plates paused and glanced toward the sideboard. He remained there, an insignificant man in an insignificant hesitation. until Mrs. Calhoun, who was not accustomed to hesitations, said brightly, "Harry?" He coughed. "Begging your pardon, madam. Might I, just a moment," and he was gone too, making for the hall with more purpose than servants usually show in front of their betters. Miss Marple's eyes met Dr. Haydock's across the table, and there was between them the slight weary patience of people who have lived long enough to know what happens next. What happened next was noise, the wrong kind for a house well run. A small cry abruptly choked, the scuttle of feet, a plate fallen somewhere far off and shattering. Mrs. Pike rose, as vicars' wives do, and then sat, remembering she had no tonic to administer. Mrs. Calhoun stood up at last, her pearls lifting with her breath. "Do excuse me," she said, and went out, Mr. Dalton half a step behind her, the knife still in his hand and then hastily put down. No one, strangely, followed at once. Society holds people at tables the way enchantments hold people in woods. They waited until the footman reappeared, pale now under his professional flush. "If you please," he said to Dr. Haydock, "would you come? It's Elsie." "What about Elsie?" Mrs. Price Ridley demanded, already packing disapproval. Dr. Haydock had no time for speeches. He was on his feet and in the hall at once, Miss Marple not far behind him. For small, neat women have a way of being everywhere. The others rose in a ragged scatter and trickled after. They found Elsie in the narrow passage by the pantry, where the linoleum had been scrubbed so determinedly it shone. She lay on her side, and the wrongness of the angle in her neck was clear even to the untrained. The little brown shoes pointed at each other, surprisingly girlish. On the floor beside her was the napkin she had been carrying from the dining room, folded crisply and, odd thing, one of the silver napkin rings with which Mrs. Calhoun had adorned the table. It had rolled beneath the pantry door as if to hide. Mrs. Calhoun, hand at her throat, said nothing. Mr. Dalton stood a pace away, his face unreadable, except for the relaxation that sometimes comes to faces when a thing long dreaded has at last arrived. Though Miss Marple, who knew more of dread than she allowed, hoped she was mistaken in that, Dr. Haydock knelt, did what men do in such circumstances, and then looked up. "She's dead." There was a silence that settled like flour dust. In that unholy quiet, Miss Marple heard three things quite distinctly: the uneven drip of something in the scullery, the metronomic click of the grandfather clock in the hall, and Mrs. Calhoun's pearls faintly knocking together. "She must have slipped," Mrs. Pike offered, "because decent people must propose decent explanations at once, or else decency cannot stand." "Slipped?" Mrs. Price Ridley repeated, her voice oddly shrill. "On linoleum? I can slip on anything if it's properly polished." Her head, Colonel Armitage said, brief and military. "There's a contusion. And this," Miss Marple said gently, stooping with the careful grace of an elderly lady who does not intend to make herself a nuisance. She picked up the napkin ring and turned it in her fingers. There was a trace of something sticky inside, almost invisible, as if someone had dabbed at it with a cloth and not quite succeeded. "Cranberry, perhaps. Cranberries got everywhere, or something else entirely. Best call the police," Dr. Haydock said, his voice now brisk and professional as the doorbell's peal had been. "A statement." "Not a request, of course," said Mrs. Calhoun. She sounded hoarse. "Of course we shall." As they stood there, held in the odd anatomy of a tragedy, heads bent, elbows close, voices low, the dining-room door slowly swung inward of its own accord, moved by a current of air from the kitchen. From the doorway, the rich scent of turkey and sage drifted forward absurdly like a cheerful guest arriving late. The fine linen on the table, the bright dessert plates with their small harvest sheaves, the place cards arranged with American hospitality, all of it waited patiently for the return of people who would not return to them as they had been. Miss Marple looked at the posture of the girl on the floor, and then, very lightly, at Mr. Dalton's shoes neatly scuffed, which had left a faint damp print on the linoleum. She looked at the napkin ring again, and the tiny sticky trace. She looked at the sideboard where the carving knife had been set down, and at the dog-eared place card that had belonged to Mr. Dalton. It still overlapped the linen set for his knife. "Just so, poor child," she said quietly. "What a dreadful thing to happen on a day of giving thanks." No one contradicted her. In the dim passage, with the smell of sage and the far, patient clock, Miss Marple folded her thin hands together and added, "For herself and for no one else. And such a very curious thing, too." The vicar's telephone stood in its corner like a sentinel, brass mouthpiece gleaming faintly in the lamplight. It was there that Dr. Haydock, in his firm, unruffled way, placed the call to the constabulary, speaking in tones measured and grave, as if a body on the floor were a regrettable but not extraordinary interruption to civilized life. Outside, a wind moved among the trees of Maple House, brushing against the windows with a patient, steady whisper, and within the house the dinner guests gathered in uneasy murmurs, unwilling to meet one another's eyes. Mrs. Calhoun sat rigidly on a gilt-backed chair near the door, her hands twisting a handkerchief to shreds. Her composure, so deliberate and bright at the table, had faded into something pale and brittle. Miss Marple stood a few paces away, quietly observant. Her eyes, so mild and blue, missed nothing. The way Mrs. Calhoun's pearls had been hastily unclasped and stuffed into her pocket, the tremor in her breath each time Mr. Dalton's name was mentioned, the subtle way Dr. Haydock avoided looking directly at her. Mr. Dalton himself stood by the mantel, his back straight, his expression composed, almost deliberate in its stillness. When people grieve or fear, Miss Marple reflected, they rarely remember to control their hands. Yet Mr. Dalton's were clasped behind him, too purposefully, and when he moved to the hearth she noted that he brushed at his cuff as though removing something unseen. She did not yet know what that gesture meant, but it sat in her mind as neatly as a pressed flower in a Bible, something to return to later. The police arrived with the familiar solemnity of small-town law. Inspector Craddock, grey, solid, patient, whose dealings with Miss Marple were of long acquaintance and usually beneficial to the side of truth. He removed his hat, inclined his head to Mrs. Calhoun, and in his even voice began the series of small, inevitable questions that make up the beginning of an inquiry. "Dr. Haydock, you confirmed the death." "Neck broken," Haydock replied curtly. "Quickly done, though not from a simple fall." "Too clean." "Indeed." Craddock's eyes moved to the floor, to the faint mark of Elsie's shoes and the napkin still folded beside her. "Was anyone near when she fell?" "No one saw it happen," Mrs. Pike offered tremulously. "She went out to fetch something. More gravy, I think, and there was a noise, oh, dreadful noise, and then Dr. Haydock went." Craddock nodded. "And the maid, was she known to you all?" "Elsie Turner," Mrs. Calhoun said faintly. "She came from Bath. My housekeeper engaged her 2 months ago. Quiet girl, very good, very neat." Her voice broke on the word neat, for the girl had been that to the last. Miss Marple, standing in her place, murmured gently, "Very neat indeed." "Her work was as careful as her nature, I fancy. People who fold napkins so evenly seldom fall in awkward positions." Craddock gave her a look both respectful and wary. He knew the weight of such mild comments. "You noticed something, Miss Marple?" "Oh, nothing, dear Inspector. Only that her napkin was folded, as though she meant to finish her errand and return. People who faint or even fall suddenly seldom place things tidily first. It suggests, well, perhaps interruption rather than accident." Mrs. Price Ridley gasped softly, scandalized by implication. "You mean to say someone pushed her, or frightened her?" Miss Marple said gently. "Fear can do quite as much harm as strength. In the right or wrong moment." There was a long silence. Mrs. Calhoun turned her face away, and Mr. Dalton's jaw tightened, a small tick of muscle betraying irritation or unease. The inspector began a quiet inspection of the passage, his torch moving over the polished linoleum, pausing at the pantry door. Then at the napkin ring Miss Marple had earlier observed. He picked it up delicately with a handkerchief, turning it under the beam of light. "Bit of something inside," he muttered. Cranberry sauce, I suppose. Miss Marple's voice floated up, mild and almost apologetic. It looked so, yes. Though I believe Elsie served only the pudding course, and cranberries, as I recall, were finished before then. Craddock looked at her more directly this time. You have a thought, ma'am? I often have thoughts, Inspector, but they are seldom the right ones. Still, it might be that whoever handled that ring last was not Elsie at all. It might have been returned to her tray in haste. Haste indeed, he murmured. Well, we'll send it along for examination. Might tell us something. From the dining room. The grandfather clock chimed softly. 9:30, and the sound of it reminded them of the half-eaten meal, the candles guttering, the wine glasses still trembling faintly. Mrs. Pike began to weep softly. Mrs. Price Ridley, in her way, scolded her for it, and Miss Marple, with a sigh, drifted to the doorway. The dining room looked very strange now, the chairs pushed back at odd angles, the turkey cooling on its platter like a monument to some lost civility. She looked at the place cards again. All were neatly arranged save one. Mr. Dalton still sat crooked, overlapping the knife line. A very small thing, yet such small things had told her the truth before. Do forgive me, she said softly, addressing no one in particular. But who sat beside Elsie's service door? Mrs. Calhoun blinked. Why, Mr. Dalton, I think. Yes, he was nearest. And you, my dear, Miss Marple said kindly, had that little silver bracelet on, the one with the tiny clasp. Mrs. Calhoun looked startled. Why, yes. What of it? Miss Marple's expression was as bland as milk. Only that I thought I saw you glance for it, as though you feared it might be gone. And one does not lose bracelets without noticing what or who is near one's arm. There was a sudden stiffness in the air, like a string drawn too tight. Dalton's voice, calm but low, broke it. Surely this isn't the time, Miss Marple. A girl is dead. We should leave gossip to another evening. Of course, Miss Marple said mildly. Gossip is so often mistaken for truth. But truth, Mr. Dalton, does have a way of continuing the conversation. Craddock frowned. I've seen no letters, but I did find this. He drew a small folded scrap of paper from his pocket, edges crumpled, faintly stained. It was in the pantry, behind the spice tins, torn corner of a larger sheet. Says only, tonight, no delay. D. Could be nothing. Could be our Mr. Dalton. Miss Marple lifted her eyes at that, the pale blue clear and steady. Yes, she said softly, though one must be careful. Many men have D for an initial, Inspector, but not many have the sort of shoes that carry foreign dust, nor the habit of marking their place at table so precisely. Craddock gave a low grunt. I knew you'd noticed something. You always do. Before Miss Marple could reply, Mrs. Calhoun rose abruptly from her chair. She had regained some composure, enough to remember her posture, though her fingers still twitched against the fabric of her skirt. Inspector, she said, her voice wavering between politeness and strain, surely this questioning can wait until morning. Everyone is shaken, and the girl, poor child, must be properly attended to. We'll see to that, madam, Craddock said kindly but firmly. But I'll need a few more words with your staff tonight. You've nothing to fear if there's nothing to hide. Mrs. Calhoun's smile came a fraction too quickly. Of course, nothing at all. You'll find everything in perfect order at Maple House. Indeed, murmured Miss Marple from the hearth, and that's sometimes the most suspicious thing of all. Mrs. Calhoun turned toward her with a look that was half irritation, half appeal, but before she could speak, the door opened, and the housekeeper, Mrs. Burton, entered. She was a tall woman with a stooped back, her apron immaculate, her face pale and drawn. "Inspector, sir," she said, "might I have a word? It's about Elsie." The room quieted. Craddock nodded. "Go ahead." She was frightened these past few days," Mrs. Burton said, her hands twisting together. "Didn't say much, never did, but she asked for the afternoon off yesterday, said she had something to fetch from the post office. something important. Came back white as linen and near shaking. I told her she was working too hard, but she just said, "No, Mrs. Burton, it isn't work that tires me, it's knowing too much." That's all she'd say. Miss Marple's needles paused mid-click. One thread caught on the other. "Knowing too much," she repeated softly. "That's a dangerous thing for a girl who sees everything and says little." Mrs. Price Ridley made a small scandalized sound. "You don't mean to say she was mixed up in something criminal?" "Not necessarily criminal," Miss Marple said, still mild, "but perhaps inconvenient to someone else." Inspector Craddock took down the words carefully, then asked, "Did she mention anyone by name?" "No, sir. Only that she'd written a letter, said it would be safe once it was posted. I don't know to whom." Miss Marple glanced up sharply. "Ah, a letter and sealing wax, and perhaps a message that did not quite reach its destination." Mrs. Calhoun's hand went to her throat. "Surely, Miss Marple, you can't think—" "My dear," said Miss Marple kindly, "I think very little until I must. But I do observe, and I find it most odd that your guest, Mr. Dalton, seemed to know your maid by sight, though you never introduced them." There was a pause, so complete it seemed to fill the room. Mr. Dalton, who had been standing by the window, turned slowly. His expression was controlled, his smile faint and cold. "That's an interesting observation, Miss Marple," he said evenly. "But you're mistaken. I never met the girl before tonight." "Ah," said Miss Marple, "perhaps not met then. But she knew you, I think. When she brought your wine, she looked rather startled, didn't she? As though she'd seen a face she'd thought was long gone." Dalton's eyes flickered, the barest shift, but enough for Miss Marple to see. It was the look of a man whose mask had slipped, if only for a moment. Mrs. Calhoun rose again, unsteady this time. "John, please, this is dreadful. Why would Miss Marple—" "Because," said Craddock, stepping forward, "there's more to this, and we'd best get to the truth now. Mr. Dalton, where were you between 8:30 and 9? "I told you," Dalton said sharply. "I arrived late, came straight from the station. Ask Mrs. Calhoun, she'll tell you." Mrs. Calhoun hesitated, and in that pause Miss Marple heard all she needed. "Yes," she said gently, "but perhaps not quite so straight. There's mud on your shoes, mud of a kind not found on the lane to Maple House, more like the sort from the meadow path by the old mill stream, and there's a shortcut from the station that way, isn't there?" Dalton said nothing. Craddock's gaze narrowed. "Were you meeting someone there, sir? A girl, perhaps?" The silence deepened until it trembled. Dalton's hands tightened behind his back, the knuckles showing white. "You're chasing shadows, Inspector. I don't know what you're implying." Miss Marple smiled faintly, the sort of smile that had unnerved many a guilty man. "Oh, I shouldn't say implication at all. I'm quite sure the truth will come along presently. It always does, you know. Rather like letters, though some arrive a little too late." And as she spoke, the front doorbell rang once more, sharp, insistent, echoing down the hall. The sound rippled through the uneasy room like a chill wind, and even the fire seemed to falter. Craddock moved to the door, his hand on the latch. On the step stood a young telegraph boy, hat askew, holding a yellow envelope. "Message for Mrs. Calhoun," he said, looking around nervously. "From London." Mrs. Calhoun took it with trembling fingers, tore it open, and went pale as paper. The note inside was brief, only 6 words, but Miss Marple, leaning gently forward, caught a glimpse as the slip fell from the woman's hand. "He knows. Burn everything. D." Miss Marple set down her knitting, the yarn unspooling across her lap like a spider's web, and the room seemed suddenly very, very quiet. The paper drifted from Mrs. Calhoun's trembling hand and landed soundlessly upon the carpet, as though even gravity wished to handle its contents delicately. The room, so still moments before, now vibrated with an invisible energy, fear, guilt, or the dreadful weight of discovery. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the slip of yellow, reading once again those 6 fateful words in her mind. He knows. Burn everything. D. A message meant to be hidden, yet arriving in full view, like a confession misplaced by the guilty hand that wrote it. Mrs. Calhoun swayed slightly, and Dr. Haydock moved forward instinctively, catching her arm before she fell. "I must sit," she murmured, her voice thin, distant. "It's nothing. Only news from London, perhaps." Her attempt at composure failed entirely as her gaze flicked toward Dalton, seeking refuge or rescue. None came. He stood frozen, his expression unreadable but his posture taut, as though he stood before an unseen tribunal. Inspector Craddock, however, wasted no time. He stepped closer, picking up the telegram with care, his thumb smoothing the crease as his eyes narrowed over the curt message. "He knows," he repeated slowly, "and burn everything. Signed D, Mrs. Calhoun. Is that your initial or Mr. Dalton's?" "It could mean anything," she said quickly, too quickly. "A coincidence, surely." Miss Marple's voice, soft as always but unrelenting in its clarity, slipped into the silence. "Coincidences," she said gently, "do occur, Inspector, but never so tidily as this. A dead girl, a telegram of warning, and 2 people with secrets between them. It's a great deal of coincidence for one evening." Dalton's jaw tightened. "You've no right to accuse us on the strength of a few stray words and a servant's misstep." "A misstep," Miss Marple repeated mildly. "An unfortunate word, Mr. Dalton, considering poor Elsie's broken neck. No, I don't accuse. I merely observe. It's the nature of old women to do so, when their knitting doesn't quite occupy the mind." Craddock folded the telegram and slipped it into his notebook. "We'll keep this as evidence. Mrs. Calhoun, I'll ask you to be candid with me now. Do you recognize this message?" Her lips moved soundlessly for a moment before words came. Yes, I think I do. It's from my husband's former business partner, Mr. Dalton. They were involved in certain financial affairs before Hank died. There were complications." She stopped, and her hands clenched in her lap. "I was told everything had been settled, but perhaps someone has found out something." Miss Marple looked down at her knitting again, letting the silence stretch. "Complications," she murmured, "are like moths, Mrs. Calhoun. One seldom notices them until they've eaten through the fabric." Craddock straightened. "So this message came from someone else, someone still in London, warning you both. He knows, meaning Elsie, perhaps." Dalton's voice cut in, sharp. "Inspector, this is absurd. That telegram could have come from anyone. You're weaving fantasies." "Perhaps," said Miss Marple, looking up serenely. "But fantasies do have a way of fitting the facts when one looks closely enough. You see, Mr. Dalton, it's not only the telegram that concerns me. It's that napkin ring, the one with the smear of sealing wax, the kind of wax used to close letters, for instance. And Elsie was said to have written one." Dalton's face went still, too still. "This is nonsense." "Possibly," she said, "but then nonsense like guilt is often very revealing in its resistance." Craddock stepped forward again, his tone crisp. "Mr. Dalton, I'll need your statement, and I'd advise against further evasions. You'll come with me to the study." For a moment, Dalton's eyes darted toward Mrs. Calhoun, pleading, warning, or both, but she turned her face away, her pearls trembling against her throat like small frightened birds. Without another word, Dalton followed the inspector into the hall, his footsteps heavy against the polished wood. When the door closed behind them, the others sat in uneasy silence. Mrs. Price Ridley's hands fidgeted with her reticule. Mrs. Pike muttered a prayer under her breath. Even Dr. Haydock, who was not easily unnerved, frowned deeply. Miss Marple, however, appeared quite calm. She gathered her knitting neatly into her lap and spoke softly, almost conversationally. "I shouldn't think, my dear Mrs. Calhoun, that Mr. Dalton was telling the whole truth. But then neither, I imagine, were you." Mrs. Calhoun looked up, startled. I don't know what you mean." "Oh, I think you do," said Miss Marple, her tone as kind as if she were speaking of a child's mischief. "The girl Elsie was frightened, you said. She'd seen something or heard something she should not have. And you were anxious, quite anxious, that she remained silent. That's why you gave her the afternoon off, isn't it? To calm her nerves, or to let her post that letter you hoped would never be sent?" Mrs. Calhoun's composure faltered entirely now. "You don't understand," she whispered. "Hank, my husband, before he died, there were papers. Deals made overseas. Money that shouldn't have moved as it did. John promised me it was all finished. Then the girl. She must have found one of the old ledgers. She came to me, so innocent, and said perhaps the police should know. I begged her not to meddle, for her own sake as much as mine. I didn't mean, oh good heavens, I didn't mean for this to happen." Miss Marple sighed softly. "I'm sure you didn't, but innocence has a way of stumbling into danger, particularly when honesty and fear live under the same roof." The sound of footsteps returning ended the confession. Inspector Craddock entered again, his face grave. "Mr. Dalton's story doesn't match yours. Mrs. Calhoun. He admits he met the girl outside earlier this evening, claims she wanted money in exchange for silence." Mrs. Calhoun buried her face in her hands. "Then she did know," she murmured. "She knew everything. And now," said Miss Marple quietly, "we must determine who feared that knowledge most." Craddock looked at her keenly. "You have a theory, Miss Marple." "Oh, not yet," she said, resuming her knitting with deliberate calm. "But I do think the truth will come out with the morning light. It has a most reliable habit of doing so, though," and she smiled faintly, "I fancy Mr. Dalton may not find it quite as welcome as the dawn." Outside, the wind rose again, rattling the windows. Somewhere within the darkened house the clock struck 10, its hollow chime echoing through the rooms, and though the guests sat together, they were each alone now, each hearing in that slow tolling the sound of something inevitable drawing closer. The grandfather clock struck again, the long mournful notes lingering through the hall, as though marking not the time but the weight of what had already passed. The guests still huddled in the drawing-room, unwilling to leave and yet wishing desperately to escape. Mrs. Calhoun sat motionless, her face pale beneath the soft lamplight, while Miss Marple, quiet as always, remained in her corner chair, her knitting laid neatly across her lap. She seemed to be thinking, no, remembering, her eyes half focused on the fire as if the flames were tracing the outline of some long-familiar truth. Inspector Craddock had been gone only a few minutes when the door opened once again, and he stepped back in, his expression unreadable. His boots left small marks on the polished floor, the dampness of November clinging to him like a shadow. "We've searched Dalton's room," he said in a voice that carried through the uneasy stillness. "Found his valise half-packed. Train ticket for London dated tomorrow morning. And this?" He held up a folded sheaf of paper sealed with red wax, the same shade as the smear found on the napkin ring. The seal was broken, the edge torn roughly. Craddock placed it on the table beside Miss Marple's chair. "An unfinished letter. Addressed to you, Mrs. Calhoun." Mrs. Calhoun stared at it as if the paper might bite. "To me? But why? He wouldn't have—" Her voice faltered into silence, but Craddock had already begun to read aloud. "My dear Honoria," he began, his voice slow, deliberate. "By the time you read this, I may be gone from St. Mary Mead. Things have grown dangerous. The girl knows too much. She's written something, and I can't be sure she hasn't already sent it. If I can persuade her tonight to see reason, all may yet be well. Burn everything that remains, as I told you before. J.D." He lowered the page. The words seemed to hang in the air like smoke. Mrs. Price Ridley gasped, and Mrs. Pike clutched at her husband's arm. Mrs. Calhoun's composure crumbled completely. She pressed both hands to her face, muffling a sob. "Oh, John," she whispered. "You fool, why did you write that?" Why did you say so much? Miss Marple's gentle voice cut softly through the silence. Because, my dear, people always say too much when they believe they've said just enough. It's a great weakness of the guilty mind. Craddock folded the letter carefully and tucked it back into his pocket. Dalton claims the letter was never meant for you to see. Says he changed his mind about sending it. He insists he didn't touch the girl after she left the dining room. And yet, said Miss Marple thoughtfully, she's dead within minutes of her leaving it. The inspector gave a slight nod. Exactly. We'll hold him for the night, at least until we've verified his story. There's more to be learned in the morning. He turned to go, but Miss Marple's quiet tone stopped him. If I might suggest, Inspector, before you go questioning the servants again, it might be worth looking in the study fireplace. Craddock frowned. The fireplace? Yes, Mrs. Calhoun's husband, I believe, kept his papers there, didn't he? Men who live with secrets have a curious habit of placing them near warmth, something about destruction being conveniently at hand. I fancy Mr. Dalton's warning to burn everything may not have gone entirely unheeded. A small silence fell. Craddock's gaze sharpened, and he motioned to one of his constables. The man disappeared down the corridor, returning moments later with a faint smell of soot and burnt paper about him. She's right, sir, he said. Still warm. Some fragments left. Craddock brought them to the table, blackened edges of what had once been larger pages, the ink blistered but faint traces still visible. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. Her eyesight was poor for close reading, but she had a gift for pattern, and even in the soot she saw what others missed. That, she said softly, pointing to a margin untouched by flame, appears to be a figure, 10,000 perhaps, and beneath it the word transfer. Dr. Haydock frowned. £10,000? That's a great deal of money. Quite, said Miss Marple. Enough to buy silence or to provoke murder when silence fails. Mrs. Calhoun's eyes filled again. It was Hank's doing, all of it. Before he died there were investments abroad, risky ones. John handled the accounts after it all fell apart. I thought it was over. But Elsie, she must have stumbled upon one of the old ledgers. She came to me that afternoon, frightened, saying she'd seen something in the book she couldn't understand, something wrong. She said she'd written it down, just in case. I begged her to say nothing. Miss Marple's voice was soft but firm. And Mr. Dalton overheard you, perhaps? Mrs. Calhoun nodded weakly. He came into the room halfway through. I didn't think, oh dear heaven, I didn't think he'd harm her. He only said he'd take care of it. I thought he meant to send her away quietly. Craddock's expression hardened. So he followed her into the passage then, tried to get the letter back. The air in the room grew tighter, the unspoken possibilities pressing upon them all. Miss Marple, eyes half closed, seemed to see it unfold before her. The frightened girl clutching her folded letter. The man waiting in the dim corridor. His voice calm, persuasive, perhaps even kind until persuasion failed. Then a hand too strong, too desperate, a cry and silence. Yes, she said softly. He meant only to frighten her. But men who live by deceit seldom know when to stop. The fire gave a sharp pop as if in answer. Craddock looked at her, a trace of respect mingling with the weight of weariness in his eyes. You've a way of putting things, Miss Marple. Almost makes me pity the fellow. Oh, pity him by all means, she replied mildly, but never excuse him. The two are quite different. It was near midnight when the constables led Dalton away. Mrs. Calhoun, hollow-eyed, had retreated upstairs. The others dispersed at last, murmuring of prayers and pity. But Miss Marple remained by the fire, her knitting untouched. The house had fallen quiet again, but her thoughts had not. Something still troubled her, the telegram, perhaps, or the wax upon the napkin ring, or the odd absence of one small detail that ought to have been there if the story were complete. When Inspector Craddock passed by once more, she stopped him gently. You'll forgive an old woman's insistence, I hope, but I should like to see the maid's room before you seal it. I believe the rest of the answer lies there, in something very small and quite ordinary. He studied her for a long moment, then nodded. Very well, Miss Marple. Let's have a look. and as they made their way down the dim corridor, the candles trembling in their holders, the faint smell of smoke and secret still lingered in the air, both waiting, patient and unrelenting for morning. The corridor to the servants' wing was colder than the rest of the house, its silence broken only by the faint hiss of the wind finding its way through the old window panes. The polished boards creaked underfoot, and the lamplight that Inspector Craddock carried threw thin, uncertain shadows against the walls. Miss Marple followed just behind him, her expression calm and unreadable, her small figure moving with a precision that made her seem almost a part of the house itself, an observer among ghosts. They reached the narrow door to Elsie's room at the far end. The brass handle was cold to the touch, and when Craddock pushed it open, the faint scent of lavender water drifted out, a young woman's attempt at prettiness amid the austerity of service. The room was neat, almost painfully so. A folded uniform on the chair, a Bible on the nightstand, and a single photograph propped against the mirror. A girl smiling awkwardly in a garden, her hand resting on the head of a dog. Miss Marple stepped softly to the little writing table beneath the window. She was tidy, she murmured, but not sentimental. Notice, nothing frivolous, no trinkets. Everything has its place. People like that seldom lose things. Craddock set his lamp on the table and began to go through the drawers carefully. "Let's see what we have here," he said. There were the usual things: a hairbrush, a few neatly folded letters from her mother, a rosary and a handkerchief with her initials embroidered in careful stitches. He held one of the letters closer to the light. Ordinary enough, home news. Nothing about London or about Mrs. Calhoun or Dalton. Miss Marple bent slightly, peering at the lower drawer. "Do you notice," she said softly, "how the dust lies evenly on the back edge of the handle? It hasn't been opened for some time, or it was closed by someone in haste. There's always a difference." Craddock crouched and gave the drawer a tug. It resisted for a moment, then slid open with a soft scrape. Inside was an old biscuit tin, its surface dented and dull. He looked up at her. "Shall we?" "If you please, Inspector," said Miss Marple mildly, as though he were offering her tea. Inside the tin lay a single folded sheet of paper and a small object wrapped in a square of muslin. The inspector lifted the paper first. The writing was firm, careful, the handwriting of someone who had gone to great pains to make her words precise. "It's her letter," he said quietly. "If anything should happen to me," he read aloud, "I ask that this be shown to the police. I have discovered that Mr. Dalton and Mrs. Calhoun have been burning papers belonging to the late Mr. Calhoun's company. I do not know why, but the papers show large sums of money transferred abroad, to accounts in names that are not real. I believe Mr. Dalton means to destroy the evidence and may harm anyone who interferes." He stopped there. For a long moment neither of them spoke. "So she did send it," Miss Marple said softly, "or meant to. But it never reached the post. Someone must have stopped her before she could post it, or persuaded her to wait. How very sad." Craddock frowned, turning the paper over. No envelope. She may have hidden it here until morning. "And this? What's this?" He unwrapped the muslin carefully. Inside was a small silver locket, plain except for a faint engraving on the back. 2 interlocked initials. H.C. "Hank Calhoun," Miss Marple murmured. "The late husband. How very odd." Craddock turned it over in his hand. The clasp was stiff, but it opened with a click. Inside, beneath a small lock of hair, was a photograph. A much younger Honoria Calhoun, smiling beside a man with a strong jaw and a restless, confident air. "Her husband," Craddock said, "and—" "Wait," he squinted, leaning closer. "There's something written behind the picture." He eased the photograph out carefully. On the reverse, in small, hurried letters, was a single phrase: "Trust no one, especially Dalton." Craddock exhaled softly. "That's clear enough." Miss Marple looked at the picture for a long moment. "It is curious," she said slowly, "that Mrs. Calhoun never mentioned her husband's suspicion. She spoke of Hank as though his dealings were unfortunate, but harmless. Yet this, she tapped the words lightly, suggests that he knew he was being betrayed. Perhaps he even tried to warn her. You think Dalton had a hand in the husband's death? Oh dear, I never think in such large strokes, she said mildly. I prefer to begin with the little things, the sort of things people overlook. For instance, the maid's body lay by the pantry not far from the dining room. She carried a folded napkin. Why? Because she meant to replace something, not serve it. And the napkin ring she carried, one of Mrs. Calhoun's, bore that smear of sealing wax, as though she had taken it from somewhere it shouldn't have been. Perhaps even from a drawer where letters had been hidden. Craddock rubbed his chin. So she discovered a letter, took it up, and before she could show anyone, Dalton stopped her. That fits. It fits, said Miss Marple softly, but it is not yet tight. There is still a loose thread, and loose threads, you know, have a way of catching the light if one waits. She straightened a little, her eyes moving around the room again. Then she crossed to the small window. Outside, the trees swayed faintly under the moonlight, and beyond them the faint glint of the mill stream was visible, silver black and still. Do you see that, Inspector? The path by the stream leads toward the railway bridge. Mr. Dalton's shoes had that same clay along the edges. He said he'd come directly from the station, but he took the long way instead. Perhaps to meet someone. Someone who sent the telegram. Craddock nodded slowly. There's sense in that. If Dalton had an accomplice, they could have warned him or her. But who else would be involved? Someone who knew the house well enough to handle its keys, said Miss Marple softly. And who would have known precisely where Mrs. Calhoun kept her husband's letters. She turned her gaze toward him, the faintest gleam in her eyes. Tell me, Inspector, who first suggested that poor Elsie had merely slipped? Craddock frowned. Mrs. Burton, the housekeeper. Yes, Miss Marple murmured. And I think perhaps we ought to have a word with her again. I fancy she knows more about wax and sealing than a servant ought to. The inspector looked at her keenly, and then with a curt nod gestured toward the door. Together they stepped back into the corridor, the lamplight trembling as it moved ahead of them. Somewhere in the house a door creaked, and the faint sound of footsteps, measured, cautious, echoed from below. Miss Marple's face remained serene, but her voice when she spoke was barely above a whisper. Hurry, Inspector. I believe the good Mrs. Burton may not be asleep at all. The corridor seemed narrower now, the lamplight pushing its way uncertainly through the shadows that clung to the walls. Craddock quickened his pace, his boots soundless on the worn runner, while Miss Marple followed close behind, her hands folded neatly before her, her expression one of calm certainty, as though she had already foreseen what they were about to find. From below came the faint creak of movement, measured, deliberate. Someone trying not to be heard. They reached the end of the servants' passage, where the stairs turned sharply toward the kitchen. Craddock motioned for silence, then leaned forward, peering down into the dim light that filtered up from below. A figure moved in the kitchen doorway, tall, angular, and unmistakably feminine. Mrs. Burton. She was bent slightly over the table, her back to them, her hand busy with something that glinted faintly in the lamplight. Craddock descended the last few steps noiselessly. "Evening, Mrs. Burton," he said at last, his voice calm but firm. The housekeeper froze. For a heartbeat she did not turn, but her shoulders stiffened, and her hand moved just slightly, too slightly. Craddock stepped forward, and she straightened quickly, her face composed, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of alarm. "Inspector," she said, "you startled me. I couldn't sleep, so I came down to see to the fire. The house feels dreadful cold tonight." Miss Marple appeared at Craddock's shoulder, her small figure seeming harmless as ever. "Indeed, Mrs. Burton," she said gently. "It must be very trying, especially after such a dreadful evening. Though I fancy it isn't the fire you've come to tend." Mrs. Burton's lips tightened. "Beg pardon." Craddock stepped closer, glancing down at the table. There lay a bundle of letters, half burned at the edges, the red wax on one of them still soft from the heat of the lamp. A small brass seal lay beside them, the kind used to close envelopes in an older household. He reached for it, but Mrs. Burton moved first, snatching it up and clutching it to her chest. "I wouldn't do that." "Ma'am," he said quietly. She hesitated, then set it down again, her hands trembling slightly. "These are nothing. Old papers, bills, odds and ends. Mrs. Calhoun asked me to clear them away." "Old bills don't carry the initials of a dead man," Miss Marple said softly. "Nor do they have sealing wax still warm at this hour. And I noticed, too, Mrs. Burton, that the wax is the same shade as what we found on the napkin ring beside poor Elsie's body." The woman's face drained of color. "You've no right at all to accuse me." "No one is accusing you yet," said Craddock, his tone clipped. "But I'd like you to explain why you were burning your employer's private correspondence after midnight." Mrs. Burton's composure wavered. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. At last she sank onto the nearest chair, her eyes fixed on the smouldering letters. "I didn't mean for harm to come to the girl," she said, her voice low. "I swear it. I only wanted to keep the peace. Mrs. Calhoun's been through enough already." Miss Marple's eyes softened, though her voice remained steady. "Peace is rarely kept by destroying the truth, Mrs. Burton. Only delayed." The woman's hands clenched in her lap. "She came to me, the girl did. Said she'd written something down and was going to send it to the police. Said she couldn't bear to have her mistress mixed up in wickedness. I told her to leave it alone, that it would bring nothing but ruin on us all. She wouldn't listen. Said she'd post it after supper. Then Mr. Dalton came looking for her." "What time?" Craddock asked sharply. "Just after 9, I'd say. He was white-faced and tight-lipped, like a man in a hurry. He asked where the maid had gone, and when I told him she was fetching something from the dining room, he went after her. That was the last I saw of either of them till the scream." Miss Marple nodded faintly, her fingers playing with the edge of her shawl. "And afterward?" Mrs. Burton looked away. Afterward, Mrs. Calhoun was near beside herself. "She came down to the kitchen, told me everything had gone terribly wrong, that I must burn what was left of Mr. Calhoun's papers before the police arrived. I told her it was madness, but she said it was the only way to save her name." Craddock exchanged a glance with Miss Marple. "You did as she asked?" Yes. I burned some, not all. I didn't want to, but I couldn't refuse her. She's been good to me, you see. Took me in when I had nowhere else to go after the war. I owed her." Miss Marple's expression softened with something almost like pity. "Loyalty is a fine thing, Mrs. Burton, but it can be misplaced. I think perhaps you were not the only one she asked for help. Mr. Dalton, too, was trying to take care of things, as she put it. Only he did so rather more drastically." Mrs. Burton's eyes widened. "You mean he killed her? That poor child." "I'm afraid so," Craddock said grimly. "And I dare say he'd have tried to make it look like an accident, if not for Miss Marple's sharp eyes." For a long moment no one spoke. The flames in the kitchen stove flickered weakly, throwing uncertain shadows across the floor. Then Miss Marple said quietly, "There is still one matter unresolved. The telegram. It came from London, and yet I think the sender was much closer than that." Craddock frowned. "You mean someone in the house?" "Yes, the line between London and St. Mary Mead passes through the next village. A person could easily have sent it there to disguise the origin. And who, I wonder, would have known the precise moment to send it so that it arrived just as the body was discovered?" Mrs. Burton looked up sharply, colour flooding her cheeks. "I swear to you it wasn't me." Miss Marple shook her head. "No, not you. You're too practical for such dramatics. But Mrs. Calhoun, well, she has a certain flair for effect. A message arriving at the perfect moment, intended perhaps to divert suspicion." Craddock's eyes narrowed. "You're suggesting she sent it herself?" "Oh, not directly," Miss Marple replied. "But she may have arranged for it. People often forget that deceit is an art of timing, and Mrs. Calhoun, I think, has practiced it longer than she admits." A faint sound interrupted them, footsteps again, this time on the stairs above. Craddock drew his revolver instinctively, gesturing for silence. Miss Marple merely folded her hands. "It will be Mrs. Calhoun," she said quietly. "She's realized the house has grown too quiet." The footsteps descended slowly, hesitantly, until at last the figure appeared at the foot of the stairs, pale in her dressing gown, eyes wide and glinting in the lamplight. "Inspector," she said softly, her voice trembling but controlled. "I couldn't rest, is it true? Have you found something more?" Miss Marple rose then, smoothing her shawl. "Yes, my dear Mrs. Calhoun," she said with gentle finality. "We've found something. I think it's time you told us the rest of the story, before Mr. Dalton's lies are no longer the worst of it." Mrs. Calhoun paused at the bottom of the stairs, her hand resting lightly on the newel post as though for balance. The lamplight fell across her face, washing away the last of its fashionable composure and revealing something worn and hollow beneath. She looked from Miss Marple to Inspector Craddock, and then to Mrs. Burton, who still sat at the kitchen table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. For a long moment no one spoke. Only the steady ticking of the clock above the hearth filled the air. "I heard voices," Mrs. Calhoun said at last, her tone brittle. It was impossible to rest with all this whispering. "I suppose you've been questioning my housekeeper again." Craddock straightened. "We've been doing more than questioning, madam. We've been uncovering what you and Mr. Dalton worked so hard to conceal. The burning papers, the missing letter, the telegram. None of it fits with innocence." Mrs. Calhoun's eyes darted toward the table where the half-burned letters still lay, their blackened edges curling inward. For an instant, she seemed about to protest, then sighed deeply and crossed to a chair, sinking into it as though her bones had turned to dust. "You think I killed that poor girl," she said quietly. "You're wrong. I never touched her. I couldn't have." "No," Miss Marple said gently. "You didn't touch her, but you made it possible for her to die, and perhaps in your way that's worse." Mrs. Calhoun looked up sharply, her breath catching. "You don't understand what it was like, what I owed my husband, what I owed myself. Hank was reckless, too trusting. He let John handle everything. By the time I knew what they'd done, the money was gone. I told myself it would be fixed before anyone noticed. But then Hank died, and John said we must keep it quiet. He said it would ruin us both if it came out." Miss Marple nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. "And so you kept quiet as so many women do. But silence has a dreadful habit of attracting company. It never stays alone for long." Mrs. Calhoun gave a short, humorless laugh. "So you sound just like him. Hank used to say that. He left me that cursed locket, you know. The one you found in the maid's room. Told me to keep it safe. I never even opened it after he died. I suppose that was foolish of me." Craddock's eyes sharpened. "You mean you didn't know what was written inside?" She shook her head. "No, I thought it was sentimental. I couldn't bear to look at it. I suppose Elsie found it when she was dusting my bureau. She must have opened it and read Hank's message. That's why she went white as a sheet when I mentioned John's name earlier this week. She said she'd discovered something important and needed to tell me privately. I was afraid then, afraid she'd bring everything crashing down." Miss Marple's gaze softened, though her tone remained calm. "So you warned Mr. Dalton?" Mrs. Calhoun hesitated. "I sent for him, yes. I told him what the girl had found and begged him to make it right. I didn't mean, oh heaven forgive me, I didn't mean he should harm her. I thought he'd pay her off, convince her to leave quietly. But he came back white as a ghost, said it was done and that we must destroy the papers before anyone could connect them. I was sick at heart, but I did what he said. What else could I do?" Craddock leaned forward. "You could have told the truth." Mrs. Calhoun gave him a long, weary look. "And have my husband's name dragged through the mud. My house seized, my reputation ruined. I've lived among your English villages long enough to know what that would mean, Inspector." "I'd be finished." Miss Marple regarded her steadily, her eyes clear as glass. "My dear Mrs. Calhoun," she said softly, "a reputation may be ruined by scandal, but a conscience is ruined by silence. One recovers from the former. The latter lingers." The woman's composure cracked at last. She covered her face with her hands, sobbing quietly. Craddock stood by, uncomfortable but patient, waiting for her to gather herself. When she finally spoke again, her voice was faint. "I didn't send the telegram. I swear it. John told me he'd arranged for a message to reach me in case the girl tried to go to the police, but I didn't know it would come tonight. He said he had a friend in London who could send it if necessary." "I suppose that was a lie, too." Miss Marple turned to Craddock. "A friend in London, indeed. Perhaps that's true, perhaps not. There's a railway telegraph office in Muchhampton, only a few miles from here. I imagine a wire sent from there would carry a London stamp easily enough, if one knew whom to ask." Craddock frowned. "And you think Dalton arranged that himself?" "Oh yes," Miss Marple said mildly. "Men like Mr. Dalton often prepare their exits long before the curtain falls. He thought the telegram would deflect suspicion, make Mrs. Calhoun seem like a victim of circumstance, and himself merely an unlucky witness. But he made one mistake." Craddock waited. "And that was?" "The telegram was too neat," Miss Marple said simply. "It arrived precisely when the body was found. Only someone already in the house could have known the timing so well." Mrs. Calhoun raised her head, startled. "Then, you mean he never left the house at all?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I mean he never left for London. I rather think, Inspector, that if you were to check the small storeroom off the pantry, the one locked from the outside, you may find that Mr. Dalton had been using it for a rather different purpose than storing table linens." Craddock's eyes widened. "You're saying he hid something there?" "Not something," said Miss Marple quietly. "Someone. A confederate, perhaps. The person who sent that wire and who helped him move the papers from your late husband's study before the police could arrive. Mrs. Calhoun said she heard footsteps downstairs just before the dinner bell. I dare say they weren't hers." The inspector wasted no time. He signalled to his constable and strode down the corridor toward the pantry. Miss Marple followed at her measured pace, Mrs. Calhoun trembling behind her. When Craddock turned the key and flung the door open, a gust of cold, stale air escaped, and then, from the shadows, a figure stirred, a man, thin, unshaven, his clothes travel-stained, blinked into the light like some cornered animal. His eyes darted to Miss Marple, then to the revolver in Craddock's hand. "Good heavens," Craddock breathed. "Who the devil are you?" The stranger's voice cracked as he spoke. "Name's Whitby. She used to work for Mr. Dalton, bookkeeping. He said I'd be safe here till morning. He told me there'd be a car waiting before dawn." Miss Marple regarded him quietly. "And you sent the telegram?" Whitby nodded once, then hung his head. "He said it was the only way to warn her, to make it look like someone else knew. I didn't want to hurt no one." Craddock's voice was low, almost pitying. "You'll have a chance to explain that at the station." Miss Marple turned to Mrs. Calhoun, who stood pale and shaking in the doorway. "There, my dear," she said softly. "You see, truth does have a way of surviving, even when buried under ash." The woman gave a broken sob, sinking into the nearest chair. Craddock signalled for his men, and as they led the trembling Whitby away, Miss Marple moved quietly to the window. Outside, the first light of dawn was breaking, soft and pale across the village roofs. "Morning," she murmured, almost to herself, "always comes sooner than one expects, and never quite as one wishes." The faint light of morning crept slowly across the kitchen floor, catching the dull gleam of the brass kettle and the pale surface of the table where the night's secrets had been laid bare. Mrs. Calhoun sat motionless, her head bowed, hands clasped tightly together as though in prayer, though it was not clear to whom she prayed or for what. Inspector Craddock stood near the window, his silhouette outlined against the thinning darkness, his mind occupied with the next inevitable steps, formal charges, statements, the grim machinery of the law that would soon roll forward. Miss Marple, however, sat quite still by the hearth, her knitting forgotten in her lap, her gaze fixed not on the dawn, but on the dying embers. She looked, as she so often did, perfectly ordinary and perfectly unremarkable. An elderly woman in a shawl who might have been thinking about her geraniums. "Whitby will talk," Craddock said at last, breaking the silence. "He'll tell us what Dalton promised him, how long he's been helping him. He's frightened enough to tell the truth now." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Yes, frightened men do tell the truth, but only the truth that suits them. Still, I dare say we shall hear most of it. The poor soul's been used like so many others. Mr. Dalton always struck me as a man who cultivated loyalty the way some people grow weeds, abundantly, but with poison at the roots." Mrs. Calhoun stirred then, lifting her head. Her voice, when it came, was low and unsteady. "Will they hang him?" "Mr. Dalton, I mean." Craddock's expression hardened. "If it's proved he killed the girl, yes. The evidence is strong, too strong to overlook." Miss Marple's eyes remained on the embers. "And yet," she said softly, "I'm not entirely sure it was he who struck the final blow." The inspector turned sharply. "What do you mean by that?" "Oh, I've no proof," she said mildly, "only that something doesn't quite fit. The violence of the act. It seems unlike Mr. Dalton's sort of wickedness. His is a careful, deliberate malice, the sort that hides behind politeness. But the girl's death was clumsy, hurried, desperation rather than calculation. So no, I think perhaps she surprised someone else." Craddock frowned. "Someone else? Who, Whitby?" Miss Marple shook her head. "Whitby's hands are soft, Inspector. Bookkeeper's hands. He wouldn't have the strength nor the stomach. And besides, he was too frightened of Dalton to act alone. No, the person I mean is someone accustomed to cleaning up other people's mistakes." Her eyes lifted then, settling gently on Mrs. Burton, who still sat rigid and pale in her chair. The housekeeper's gaze flicked up and then away, her fingers twisting in her apron. "I don't know what you mean," she whispered. "Of course you do," Miss Marple replied gently. "You see, my dear, I noticed something last night when we found poor Elsie. Her shoes were neatly together, so neat, in fact, that it seemed odd for someone who had fallen. But when you rushed into the passage afterward, you tripped slightly, didn't you?" "On the same spot?" "Because you knew where the shoes had been placed." "You placed them yourself after she fell." Mrs. Burton's lips parted, but no sound came. "You didn't mean to kill her," Miss Marple continued quietly, "but she was frightened and she tried to run. You caught her arm, tried to stop her. Perhaps to reason with her, perhaps to take the letter she'd written. There was a struggle. She fell, her neck broke. You didn't mean it, but when you realized what had happened, you panicked. Mr. Dalton came upon you soon after, and together you agreed what must be done." Craddock took a sharp step forward. "Is this true, Mrs. Burton?" The woman buried her face in her hands. "I never meant to hurt her," she sobbed. "God help me, I didn't. She said she'd go to the police that night, said she'd tell everything about the money and the papers. I begged her to wait, just till morning, but she wouldn't listen. I tried to stop her going through that door, and she fell. There was a terrible sound. I'll never forget it." Miss Marple inclined her head sadly. "And Mr. Dalton arrived soon after?" "Yes," Mrs. Burton whispered. "He came out of the dining room. He'd heard the noise. When he saw what had happened, he told me to keep quiet. Said he'd take the blame if it came to it, but he had to make it look as though someone else had been there. He moved her body, took the napkin ring from the tray, said it would draw attention away from the passage. I wanted to tell Mrs. Calhoun, but he said that would ruin her too." Mrs. Calhoun let out a soft cry, covering her mouth. "You fool," she whispered. "You should have come to me." Mrs. Burton looked up at her, eyes red and desperate. "I couldn't, ma'am. You told me yourself those papers must never be found. I thought if I kept quiet it would all go away." Craddock's face was grim. "You understand what you've admitted to, Mrs. Burton? Even if it wasn't deliberate, the law will see it as manslaughter." The woman nodded weakly. "I'll say what I must. I've no right to mercy." Miss Marple reached out and laid a gentle hand on the table. "Mercy is a curious thing," she said softly. "It often arrives not when we ask for it, but when we finally tell the truth." For a while no one spoke. Outside, the early light grew stronger, filling the kitchen with a dull, wintry glow. The night's sharp edges began to blur into the pale, weary calm of morning. At last, Craddock drew a long breath. "We'll take her to the station with the others," he said quietly. "She'll have to give a full statement." He turned to Mrs. Calhoun. "You'll stay in the village, madam, until this is concluded. There will be questions about the finances, your husband's dealings. I suggest you tell the truth from the start." Mrs. Calhoun nodded faintly. "I've nothing left to hide." When the inspector and his men had gone, the kitchen fell silent again. Miss Marple rose, gathering her shawl about her shoulders. She looked at the empty hearth, the cold ashes within it, and sighed softly. "Such a sad little tale," she murmured. "So many good intentions gone astray. People often think wickedness arrives in grand gestures, but it so often comes quietly, through small fears and smaller lies." Mrs. Calhoun looked up, her eyes hollow. "You think me wicked?" Miss Marple smiled faintly, the kindness in it both genuine and firm. "No, my dear, only human. And that, I'm afraid, is much the same thing." Outside, the first sound of the village stirring reached their ears, the clatter of a milk cart, the distant crow of a rooster greeting the day. Miss Marple turned toward the door, her step steady. "I believe," she said almost to herself, "that I shall go home now. There's something comforting about tea at daybreak. It reminds one that the world, for all its folly, does go on." And with that, she left Maple House behind, her small figure moving down the misty lane, the morning light catching the edge of her grey shawl, as though even the sun recognized that justice, quiet, unassuming, and utterly relentless, had once again walked through St. Mary Mead. Mist hung low over St. Mary Mead that morning, soft and pearly, folding itself around the hedgerows and cottages, as if the village itself wished to forget the dreadful business of the night before. Miss Marple walked slowly along the lane, her shoes making faint prints in the dew, the tip of her umbrella brushing lightly against the stone wall beside her. Behind her, Maple House loomed faintly through the mist, its tall windows dim and unwelcoming, now that truth had stripped it of its charm. The silence of dawn felt heavy, yet not oppressive. It was the silence that follows revelation, when all that can be said has been said and what remains is to understand. As she neared the elms, her own modest home, Miss Marple's thoughts moved in their gentle, methodical way through the chain of events. She had not slept. She rarely did after such affairs. Her mind, though clear, was tinged with sorrow. Murder, she had often reflected, was not so much a matter of wickedness as it was of weakness, people cornered by their own folly, afraid of disgrace, or too vain to bear it. Poor Mrs. Calhoun, she thought, had meant to protect her late husband's memory, and poor Mrs. Burton had meant to protect her mistress. Each, in her own way, had been blind to the harm such loyalty could breed. And the maid, young Elsie, so sensible, so precise, had been the only honest one of the lot, and for that she had paid with her life. Miss Marple set her umbrella by the front door and went straight to the kitchen, where the kettle still stood waiting from the night before. As it began to hum, she allowed herself a sigh. The little house smelled of lavender and lemon polish, comforting smells, reminders that the world was for most still ordinary. She poured herself a cup of tea, then sat at her small table by the window, the mist beyond it thick as milk. But even as she lifted the cup to her lips, there was a knock at the door. It was not sharp or official. The police, she knew, would not have come so early, but rather tentative, almost apologetic. When she opened the door, she found young Dennis Reed, the bank clerk who had been one of Mrs. Calhoun's dinner guests, standing awkwardly on the step. "Hat in hand, Miss Marple," he began, his voice low. "I do beg your pardon for calling so early, but, well, I couldn't think of anyone else to go to." She regarded him kindly. "I have done quite right, Mr. Reed. Do come in. You look as though you've had no breakfast." He flushed slightly, but obeyed, perching on the edge of a chair as she poured another cup. "It's about last night," he said after a pause. I can't get it out of my head. The way Mrs. Calhoun looked, and that housekeeper, and the poor girl lying there. I suppose the inspector has everything sorted. As much as he can for now, Miss Marple said gently. Mrs. Burton has confessed that she struggled with Elsie. It was by all accounts accidental. Reed hesitated, frowning into his tea. Yes, I heard that much, but I'm not sure it's the end of it. You see, Miss Marple, I was at the bank early this morning sorting through some foreign drafts we'd held from the Calhoun estate, and there's something odd, something that doesn't fit. She looked at him with quiet interest. Go on. Well, he said, leaning forward, we received a transfer last week from an account in Geneva, 10,000, same as the figure found in those burnt papers. But the account wasn't in Mr. Dalton's name, nor Mrs. Calhoun's. It was under H.C., the initials of the late Mr. Calhoun, but the signature was dated after his death. Miss Marple set down her cup. After? She repeated softly. How very intriguing. And who authorized the withdrawal? Reed hesitated. That's the strangest part. The signature looked like Mr. Dalton's hand, but the witness was a woman. The name was Burton. A small silence followed. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, though her face remained serene. Mrs. Burton again, she murmured. So she was involved in more than just a cover-up. She and Dalton must have worked together to divert the funds, and the poor maid's discovery of the papers threatened to expose them both. Yes, that makes sense, Reed frowned. But if she confessed to killing Elsie, then it's all settled, isn't it? Miss Marple shook her head gently. Not quite, my dear. Mrs. Burton's guilt lies in the struggle that caused the girl's death, yes, but Dalton's wickedness lies deeper. He used her as a pawn, and if I am not mistaken, he never meant to share those ill-gotten gains. Whitby was meant to be the scapegoat. Mrs. Burton the silence, and Mrs. Calhoun the respectable shield. A tidy arrangement if one has no conscience. Reed looked troubled. Then there's more yet to come? I'm afraid so, said Miss Marple, standing and wrapping her shawl tighter. Inspector Craddock will need to hear this at once. You've done very well, Mr. Reed. I dare say you may have just provided the missing thread. They set out together toward the station, where the constables were still busy with statements. Craddock listened gravely as Reed explained the discovery, his pen moving swiftly over his notebook. When he was done, he glanced up. Forgery, then, he said, and posthumous fraud. That ties Dalton to the money, but it also means Mrs. Burton's story may not be the whole of it. Precisely, Miss Marple said softly. I think Mrs. Burton believed she was protecting Mrs. Calhoun, but she was really protecting Dalton. He had no intention of saving her. He meant to vanish with that money once the dust had settled. Craddock rose abruptly. He'll be on the early train if he's clever. But clever men make mistakes when they panic. Within the hour they reached the small railway station on the edge of the village. The mist was lifting now, revealing the pale track stretching away into the countryside. A few passengers milled about, but none so conspicuous as the tall figure in a dark coat near the end of the platform. Dalton, his valise beside him, scanning the horizon as if willing the train to appear sooner. Craddock signaled his men, but Dalton saw them first. He bolted toward the far exit, his footsteps echoing on the platform. The constables gave chase, but it was Miss Marple who raised her hand and said almost calmly, Not that way, Inspector. The tracks curve east. He'll double back toward the road. And indeed, moments later, Dalton reappeared near the goods yard, cornered between two fences. He turned, eyes wild, realizing there was nowhere left to go. It wasn't my fault, he shouted hoarsely. It was all her idea, Calhoun's wife. She wanted the money. Miss Marple stepped forward, her voice quiet but unyielding. And yet it was you who wrote the signature. You who planned the telegram. You who let a frightened girl die so that you might buy your freedom. Dalton's defiance faltered. For a moment he seemed to shrink into himself. Then with a weary motion he dropped the valise and raised his hands. You old witch, he muttered bitterly. You see too much. Craddock moved in quickly, snapping the cuffs around his wrists. "And you said too much," he replied. Miss Marple watched as they led him away, the morning sun finally breaking through the mist. The village roofs shone faintly in the light, and a soft breeze stirred the trees. She turned toward Dennis Reed, who stood beside her, wide-eyed and pale. "You see, Mr. Reed," she said gently, "truth has a way of finding its way home. It may take the long road, but it never loses its path." And as the train whistle sounded in the distance, Miss Marple lifted her umbrella once more and began the walk back to St. Mary Mead, her step light, her heart heavy, yet her gaze steady as ever, for she knew that though justice had been done, the village would never be quite so peaceful again. The air in St. Mary Mead that afternoon had the quiet gentleness peculiar to English villages after a storm of scandal, as though the hedges themselves wished to draw a curtain over human folly. Life, as it always did, resumed its polite rhythm. The postman whistled on his rounds, the vicar's wife arranged flowers in the nave, and Mrs. Price Ridley was already telling anyone who would listen that she had known from the start that Mrs. Calhoun's Thanksgiving was bound to end in disgrace. At the Elms, Miss Marple sat by her fireside, a small pot of tea at her elbow, and a basket of pale wool on her lap. The room was perfectly still, save for the occasional crackle from the hearth. She was not thinking precisely, not the deliberate sort of thinking one does when piecing together a crossword, but letting her thoughts drift, as they so often did after the unpleasant clarity of a solved crime. A gentle knock interrupted her reverie. "Come in," she called, and a moment later Inspector Craddock entered, his hat in his hand and a look of weariness softened by respect. "I thought you'd like to know," he said, settling heavily into the armchair opposite. "It's all wrapped up. Dalton confessed on the way to London. The whole sordid scheme. The forged signature, the Swiss account, the plan to vanish with the money. Mrs. Burton's statement matched his in the parts that mattered, though she'll likely face a lesser charge. As for Mrs. Calhoun, the Crown won't prosecute. The bank will reclaim what it can, and she'll have little left but the house and her shame." Miss Marple nodded gravely. "That will be punishment enough, I should think." "Vanity has sharper teeth than justice when it turns on its owner." Craddock smiled faintly. "You have a way of putting things, ma'am. There's one bit that still puzzles me, though. The telegram. Dalton swore it was Whitby who sent it from Muchhampton, but the timing, good Lord, it was almost exact. How could he have known the maid was dead before anyone in the house raised the alarm?" Miss Marple poured him a cup of tea, her eyes twinkling just slightly. "He couldn't have known, Inspector, but he could have ensured the telegram arrived at whatever hour he chose. You see, it wasn't sent after the murder at all, it was sent before. Dalton wrote it earlier that evening, and arranged for Whitby to dispatch it at precisely 9 o'clock. He wanted it to seem as though someone else, perhaps an accomplice or rival, had learned his secret. It was meant to divert suspicion from himself, and if possible frighten Mrs. Calhoun into silence." Craddock frowned, then let out a low whistle. "So even his own alibi was a trap of his own making." "Exactly. Wickedness, Inspector, is very much like embroidery, full of elaborate designs but doomed to unravel at the first wrong stitch. Dalton was clever enough to plan deceit, but not clever enough to understand that deceit always bears its maker's pattern." Craddock chuckled softly, shaking his head. "I don't know how you do it. Every time I think I've got it pinned down, you find one last thread I've missed." Miss Marple smiled, modest but amused. "Experience, my dear Inspector. People behave much the same in murder as they do in church bazaars. It's always the small inconsistencies that give them away. A crooked place card, a too tidy corpse, a maid's shoes neatly together when they shouldn't be. The truth is rather like dust, you know. However one may sweep it aside, it always settles back in view." Craddock raised his teacup in salute. "To dust, then, and to the lady who notices it." She laughed softly. "Oh, don't make me sound too clever. I merely pay attention. Life, if you watch it long enough, shows you everything. For a while they sat in companionable silence, the fire crackling gently between them. Outside the mist had lifted, revealing the mellow gold of late afternoon. Somewhere a blackbird was singing, untroubled by the human dramas that had unfolded in its hearing. At length Craddock stood, setting down his empty cup. "Well, I'll be off. There'll be reports to file, no doubt, and Mrs. Price Ridley to contradict before she rewrites the whole affair in her own image. Thank you, Miss Marple, for everything. I'll sleep easier knowing you're keeping an eye on St. Mary Mead." She smiled up at him. "It's kind of you to say so, Inspector, though I fancy the village would rather I kept both eyes closed. People are fond of mysteries, but they do dislike the solving of them." When he had gone, Miss Marple rose and moved to the window. The village lay peaceful below, smoke curling from chimneys. The faint sound of a child's laughter carried on the breeze. She thought of Elsie, the young maid whose honesty had cost her life, and of Mrs. Burton, whose misguided loyalty had destroyed her peace. She thought too of Mrs. Calhoun, alone now in her grand house, learning that gratitude and guilt are not the same thing. In her gentle, unhurried way, Miss Marple reached for her knitting once more. The soft click of needles began again, steady and precise, each stitch perfectly measured. "People do make such dreadful muddles of things," she murmured to herself. "A little patience, a little truth, and so much trouble might be spared." The clock chimed the half-hour. She glanced at it absently, then smiled, a small knowing smile. The case was closed, the pattern complete, the threads neatly tied off. Outside, the first golden leaves of autumn drifted past the window, catching the late sunlight before falling silently to earth. And in that quiet moment, with the world once again set right, or as right as the world ever could be, Miss Marple, the gentle guardian of St. Mary Mead, sipped her tea and began her next row, humming softly, as if nothing in all her peaceful village had ever been amiss.